My older brother, who sacrificed all his dreams for me after our parents died, ended up taking my future wife and hiding it. Billy wasn't just my older brother, he was my entire world. After we lost our parents when I was 10, he stepped into a role number 22-year-old should ever have to shoulder. He wasn't prepared for it, but he gave up everything to raise me. College dreams? Gone. Social life? Non-existent. He worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet, all while making sure I never felt the full weight of what we'd lost. In those early years, Billy was my rock, my parent, and my best friend all rolled into one. I'll never forget the sacrifices he made. He sold his car, his pride and joy, to pay for my summer camp fees because I'd been too afraid to tell him how badly I wanted to go. He skipped out on dates, friendships, and nights out, all because he was determined to make sure I had a real shot at life. Whenever I doubted myself, Billy was there to remind me that I was capable of anything. He never let me wallow in self-pity or feel less than anyone else, even when the world felt like it was falling apart. So, when I introduced Kylie, the woman I was sure I'd spend my life with, it felt like a full-circle moment. Billy was the first person I called when I decided to propose, and he even helped me pick out the ring. He joked that Kylie was the only person on earth who could get me to dress like an adult for dinner, and how it was about time someone kept me in line. To me, his approval wasn't just nice, it was everything. Billy had always been my moral compass, my example of how to love and be loved. If he liked Kylie, I knew I was making the right choice. Looking back, there were moments I should have noticed. Small, fleeting moments of tension or glances that lingered just a little too long. At the time, I chalked it up to Billy being his overprotective self. He'd always been fiercely critical of anyone who didn't treat me right, so I assumed any awkwardness was his way of trying to suss out whether Kylie was truly the one for me. But now I wonder if it was something else, something darker, lurking just beneath the surface. The truth didn't come out all at once. It wasn't a heated confession or a drunken slip of the tongue. No, it unraveled slowly, piece by horrifying piece. At first, it was just a nagging feeling, the kind you push down because you can't imagine someone you love could betray you like that. But once the full picture came into focus, it was clear this wasn't a mistake or a fleeting lapse in judgment. What Billy did wasn't an accident. It was calculated. And it shattered everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family. For a while, life felt almost perfect. Kylie and I were planning our wedding, and Billy was right there beside me every step of the way. I'd ask him for advice, and he'd always say something like, "It's your day, little bro. Do what makes you happy." He even offered to host our engagement party at his house, which, looking back, was one of those moments I should have questioned. The party itself was amazing, beautiful decorations, great food, and all the people I cared about gathered in one place. Billy seemed to be everywhere, running the show, making sure everything went smoothly. And Kylie? She looked radiant. We were the center of attention, the couple everyone toasted to, but there were moments where I'd look around and catch Billy and Kylie in conversation. Their heads close together, laughing at some private joke. It didn't seem weird at the time. Kylie and Billy had always gotten along, but now those moments play in my head like a warning I should have heeded. Things didn't really start to feel off until months later. Kylie began acting differently, distant in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. She'd claimed she was tired from work or overwhelmed by wedding planning, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? I loved her, and I trusted her completely. Still, little things started piling up. She began spending more time at Billy's place, supposedly working on wedding details or picking up things for the party planning. At first, I didn't think much of it. Billy was a huge part of my life, and I figured it made sense for him and Kylie to grow close. They were family now, after all. But then there were the unexplained absences. Nights when Kylie said she was out with friends but wouldn't answer her phone. Times when Billy would cancel plans with me last minute, saying he had work commitments but then didn't post anything about it like he usually did. There was one moment that really made me pause, though. Kylie left her phone on the counter while she was in the shower, and a text from Billy popped up on the screen. It wasn't anything overtly suspicious, just something about last night being fun and how they had to be more careful. My stomach twisted, but I told myself I was overreacting. Billy had been my hero for so long, and Kylie was the woman I was going to marry. There was no way they'd betray me like that, right? I ignored it. I wanted to ignore it. But once the seed of doubt was planted, I couldn't stop noticing the little things that didn't add up. The secretive glances, the inside jokes, the way Kylie would sometimes get defensive if I asked about her plans. It felt like I was going crazy, like I was the one ruining things by even questioning it. Then came the night everything started to unravel. It was a Friday, and Kylie said she was going to her friend's house for a girls' night. She left around 6 p.m., kissed me goodbye, and told me not to wait up. Something about the way she said it made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling down. Billy, meanwhile, texted me around 7, saying he had to cancel our usual Friday beer night because he was exhausted from work. I didn't think much of it, until I saw his car parked in the lot of a restaurant on the other side of town. I was driving past on my way to grab takeout when I spotted it. Billy's truck was unmistakable, and as I stared at it, the uneasiness I'd been ignoring for months came roaring back. Against my better judgment, I parked and walked into the restaurant. And there they were. Billy and Kylie, sitting in a booth, heads close together, laughing over drinks. For a second, I thought maybe it was innocent. Maybe they were planning some kind of surprise for me. But then I saw the way she touched his hand, the way he leaned in just a little too close. I turned and walked out before they could see me. My head was spinning, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I didn't know what to think or feel, anger, confusion, heartbreak. All of it hit me at once, but I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't nothing. This was the beginning of the end. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Kylie and Billy at that restaurant came rushing back. Her hand brushing against his, their heads tilted close in what looked like an intimate conversation, it was seared into my mind. By morning, I was wound so tightly that every breath felt like it might unravel me. When Kylie came into the kitchen, she looked like nothing had happened. She moved around the room casually, scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee in hand. It was infuriating how normal she seemed. I tried to gauge her mood, to see if there was any hint of guilt or hesitation in her demeanor, but she seemed perfectly at ease. I asked her about her supposed girls' night, testing the waters, trying to see if she'd come clean on her own. She didn't. Without missing a beat, she launched into some vague story about staying up late talking with friends. Her voice was calm, her expression easy. It was a masterclass in lying. My stomach churned. I pushed a little further, letting her know I'd seen her at the restaurant. Her reaction was instant, a flicker of something in her eyes, something close to panic, before she quickly composed herself. She dismissed it outright, spinning a story about how she and Billy had run into each other by coincidence. According to her, they'd exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. It was a plausible explanation if I hadn't already seen the way they were sitting together, the way they leaned in close, their body language betraying the casual tone she now insisted on. Still, she stuck to her story, her voice tinged with exasperation as if I was the one being unreasonable for questioning her. What caught me off guard was how quickly she flipped the narrative. She turned the conversation back on me, accusing me of being paranoid, of reading too much into an innocent situation. The way she spoke, calm but sharp, like she was the victim here, made me second-guess myself, just for a moment. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd seen it with my own eyes. When I told her I planned to talk to Billy about it, her composure wavered. It was subtle, a tightening of her jaw, a shift in her posture, but it was there. She brushed off my comment, pretending not to care, but I could tell she was rattled. After she left the room, slamming the door behind her, I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. I wasn't sure what hurt more, seeing what I'd seen, or the way she tried to manipulate me into doubting it. Kylie had shown her hand, but Billy was still a question mark. I needed to hear it from him, to confront him and see if he'd confirm or deny what I already knew in my gut. The thought of that conversation made my stomach turn, but there was no avoiding it. Billy had always been my rock, my protector. Now, I had to face the possibility that he wasn't who I thought he was. Confronting Billy felt like stepping into the lion's den. Even as I drove to meet him, part of me clung to the hope that this was all a misunderstanding. This was Billy, after all, the man who had given up so much for me, who had always been my biggest supporter. The idea of him betraying me felt impossible, and yet, I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. Billy had suggested we meet at our usual bar, a place that had always been a refuge for us, filled with laughter and shared memories. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting casually at the counter with a beer in hand, watching a game on the TV above. He greeted me like nothing was wrong, smiling and slapping me on the back as if it were any other day. For a moment, I wondered if I was overthinking everything. Maybe Kylie really had been telling the truth, and this confrontation was unnecessary. But the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. I played along with the small talk at first, letting the conversation meander through the usual topics, work updates, jokes about the game. My chest felt tight, every word out of my mouth forced as I tried to find the courage to bring up what I'd seen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I asked him about Kylie. His reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His hand froze briefly, his expression shifting just enough to catch my attention. He said they'd run into each other earlier in the week, offering a simple explanation that mirrored Kylie's almost word for word. The ease with which he said it might have been convincing if I hadn't already seen the two of them together. The rehearsed nature of his response made my heart sink. It wasn't just the words he said, it was the way he avoided looking at me directly, the slight tension in his voice. There was something he wasn't saying, and I could feel it. When I pressed further, mentioning that I'd seen them at the restaurant, his demeanor shifted. The easygoing smile faded, replaced by defensiveness. He demanded to know what I was implying, acting as though my questions were an attack on his character. He talked a lot after that, his voice growing sharper as he tried to spin the situation. He painted himself as the loyal brother, someone who was only supporting Kylie through the stress of wedding planning. But the more he talked, the more his words felt hollow, like they were meant to deflect rather than reassure. And then he said it, that I was out of line to accuse him after everything he'd done for me. The weight of that statement hit me hard, dredging up memories of all the sacrifices he'd made over the years. But instead of making me doubt myself, it only fueled the anger simmering inside me. I told him I needed answers, demanded an explanation that made sense. The silence that followed was deafening. Billy just sat there, his mouth opening slightly as if to respond, but no words came. He looked caught, trapped between his pride and the truth. That silence confirmed everything I'd been afraid of. Billy had always been the one person I believed would never hurt me, but now even that trust was shattered. I left the bar that evening feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The brother who had once been my hero was now at the center of my deepest betrayal. Walking away from the bar, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Billy's silence had been louder than any confession, and the weight of it followed me home. When I walked through the door, Kylie was lounging on the couch, scrolling on her phone, completely at ease. The sight of her made my stomach churn. I avoided her that night. I couldn't bring myself to hear more excuses, more lies. But the next morning, I couldn't hold back. I told her I'd spoken to Billy, that his version didn't add up either. Her face went pale, and she scrambled to explain, tripping over herself with excuses. She insisted I was wrong, that I was imagining things, but her panic was palpable. I didn't answer her pleas, and the days that followed were a fog of tension. Kylie tried to act cheerful, throwing herself into wedding plans, but it only made her dishonesty more glaring. Meanwhile, Billy went completely silent, no calls, no texts. The absence of my brother, once my closest confidant, was deafening. The final blow came a few days later when a friend who worked at the restaurant reached out. She'd seen me that night and hesitated to say anything, but when I pressed, she confirmed what I feared. Billy and Kylie hadn't just been talking. They were holding hands, leaning in, their body language unmistakable. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was betrayal. And now, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth was undeniable now, a weight I couldn't escape. Billy and Kylie had betrayed me in a way that felt deliberate, calculated. The pain hollowed me out, leaving only anger and disbelief. I kept my distance from Kylie at first, watching her forced smiles and fake cheerfulness as she pretended everything was fine. Billy's silence, though, was the real betrayal. The brother who had once been my protector couldn't even face me now, and his absence said everything. When I finally confronted Kylie, it was late one evening. I told her I knew the truth. She tried to deny it, her voice cracking with weak excuses, but when I mentioned my friend's account, she froze. Instead of confessing, she blamed me, accusing me of jealousy. Her gaslighting was the final straw. I told her it was over and left the room before she could respond. The next day, I called Billy. His voice was guarded, and when I told him what I knew, he tried to deflect. But his silence and hesitation betrayed him more than his words. He couldn't deny it, and I didn't need him to. By the end of that call, I knew there was nothing left to salvage. That night, I blocked them both, not out of anger, but to protect myself. They had shown me exactly who they were, and I wouldn't let them hurt me any further. But cutting them out didn't erase the pain. Moving on would be its own battle, but at least now, I could begin. The days after cutting them off felt quiet, almost unnervingly so. Without Billy's regular check-ins or Kylie's chatter about wedding details, the silence in my life was deafening. But for the first time in weeks, I also felt a strange sense of clarity. The constant tension, the second-guessing, it was gone. What remained was raw, unfiltered heartbreak. I threw myself into work, trying to keep my mind occupied, but the emptiness lingered. Every little reminder of them, a photo on my phone, a half-finished guest list for a wedding that would never happen, was like a fresh wound. It was tempting to call, to demand more answers, but I stopped myself every time. What could they say that I didn't already know? My friends became my lifeline during this time. I told a few of them what had happened, and their outrage was both validating and comforting. They rallied around me, inviting me out to dinners or just over to hang out, keeping me distracted when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm me. One evening, while sorting through some boxes Kylie had left behind, I came across an old photo of Billy and me. It was from years ago, back when we still had each other's backs. He had his arms slung over my shoulder, grinning like the world was ours to take. I stared at it for a long time, wondering how we'd ended up here. Despite everything, part of me still missed him. Cutting him out wasn't easy, it felt like losing two people at once, the brother who raised me and the stranger who betrayed me. But I knew there was no going back. Trust, once broken, doesn't come back whole. Slowly, I began rebuilding my life without them. It wasn't easy, and some days were harder than others. But every step away from the chaos felt like a small victory. I didn't need their apologies or explanations anymore. What I needed was peace, and I was determined to find it. As the weeks turned into months, the sting of betrayal dulled, though it never fully disappeared. What replaced it was a growing determination to rebuild my life, not just to move on, but to make it better. I threw myself into things I'd neglected during the whirlwind of the last year. I reconnected with old friends, picking up conversations that had fallen to the wayside. They welcomed me back with open arms, and their support felt like a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. We laughed about memories from years past, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of genuine joy. One night, my best friend convinced me to join a pickup basketball game with some of our college buddies. At first, I hesitated, worried I wouldn't enjoy it. But as soon as the game started, something shifted. Running up and down the court, feeling the rush of competition, I realized how much I'd missed doing things purely for myself. I also started therapy, a decision that felt long overdue. Talking through everything, unpacking the layers of pain and confusion, was hard but necessary. My therapist didn't just help me process the betrayal, they helped me see patterns I hadn't noticed before. My tendency to put others first, even to my own detriment. My need for validation from people who didn't always deserve it. Recognizing these things was painful, but it gave me clarity. Kylie and Billy were no longer part of my day-to-day life, but their shadows lingered. I still avoided places where I might run into them, still braced myself whenever I heard someone mention their names. But as time passed, I found myself thinking about them less and less. I started focusing on goals that had taken a back seat during my relationship: travel, learning new skills, even exploring a side hustle I'd always been curious about. It wasn't about distracting myself. It was about rediscovering who I was outside of all the chaos. The real turning point came one evening when I was sitting on my balcony, watching the sunset. For the first time, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for apologies or explanations. I wasn't replaying old arguments in my head. I was just, okay. And being okay felt like the biggest victory of all. Months passed, and life started to feel normal again, or at least, a new version of normal. The pain was still there, buried deeper now, but manageable. I wasn't entirely over what had happened, I wasn't sure I ever would be. But I'd reached a point where it no longer consumed me. Billy and Kylie stayed out of my life. There were no texts, no calls, no desperate attempts at reconciliation. At first, their silence stung, it felt like proof they didn't care enough to fight for me. But over time, I realized their absence was a gift. It gave me space to heal, to focus on myself without their influence looming over me. There was one moment, though, where the past tried to claw its way back. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday, as I was leaving the grocery store. I spotted Billy across the parking lot, his unmistakable gait and familiar features striking me like a lightning bolt. He didn't see me, and I froze, unsure whether to walk away or approach him. For a brief, impulsive second, I considered crossing the lot, demanding answers I'd never gotten. But as I watched him, head down, fumbling with his keys, I realized something. I didn't need his answers anymore. The questions that had haunted me for so long: why did he do it? How could he betray me? Had lost their power. Knowing wouldn't change what had happened, and it wouldn't heal the scars left behind. So, I let him go. I turned and walked away, leaving him in the past where he belonged. That moment was more cathartic than I expected. It wasn't forgiveness, not in the traditional sense, but it was freedom. I wasn't tethered to the pain anymore. Billy and Kylie had taken so much from me, but they wouldn't take my future. From then on, I felt lighter. I started to make plans for myself, small things like weekend hikes or trying a new hobby, and bigger goals like booking a solo trip abroad. It wasn't about running away but about reclaiming the parts of myself that had been lost in the chaos. Closure didn't come from them. It came from me, from realizing that I didn't need their regret or their explanations to move forward. I could write my own ending to this chapter, and that ending didn't include them. It's strange how life rebuilds itself, piece by piece, without you even realizing it. One day, you're staring at the wreckage, convinced you'll never recover. And then, almost quietly, you notice the cracks aren't as sharp anymore. The ache dulls. You start laughing at stupid jokes again, making plans for the weekend, dreaming about things you'd forgotten to dream about. That's where I am now, not fully healed, but moving forward. For so long, my life had revolved around other people, pleasing them, trusting them, giving them pieces of myself. Losing Billy and Kylie forced me to recenter, to figure out who I was without their influence. In the process, I discovered a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. I wasn't the person who relied on others for validation anymore. I wasn't the little brother desperate for approval or the partner bending over backward to avoid conflict. I was just, me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. A few weeks ago, I took the solo trip I'd been planning, a week in the mountains, hiking trails I'd only ever seen in pictures. There was something profoundly liberating about being alone in such a vast, quiet place. No distractions, no reminders of the past, just me and the wilderness. Standing at the summit of one of those trails, with the wind whipping around me and the world sprawling out below, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace. Not the kind of fleeting peace that comes from distraction, but a deep, grounded sense that I was going to be okay. I still think about Billy and Kylie sometimes, but not in the same way. The anger is gone, replaced by a quiet resignation. What they did was unforgivable, but I've accepted that. Their choices don't define me, and I refuse to let their betrayal dictate the rest of my life. These days, I'm focused on what's ahead. I've started making plans that excite me, learning to play guitar, volunteering at a local shelter, maybe even trying my hand at writing. It's not about filling the void they left, it's about building something new, something that's entirely mine. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story. It's a painful chapter, sure, but it's not the whole book. You can grieve, you can rage, but eventually, you have to turn the page. And as I look ahead, I'm realizing that the best chapters are still waiting to be written.